Several weeks ago, I asked the members of this congregation to write down a word or a phrase that describes Simpsonville Christian Church to them, and the response that I got was terrific. And the word that was most common that we got back was the word family. And that makes perfect sense. I think that's a great word. I think it's the right word. To see ourselves as a family means that we have the love and the comfort, the support and the nurture that a family should have. It shows that we're a healthy congregation. And I think it's a great opportunity to use as a foundation as we build the next part of our story together as Simpsonville Christian Church, to evolve from becoming a family to becoming a home. To becoming not only a place where those people really love and care about one another, but a place where others on the weary road of life can come and find a place to set down roots, a place to call home of their own. And we are exploring this topic of home in a sermon series. That began this month with our homecoming, which was a wonderful time that we had all people who have been involved with this church come to visit us again for celebration. And I'm doing this sermon series during this month, and we're exploring the metaphor of home from several different dimensions. So the first week we talked about home being a place. And we talked about how the physical, geographic location in which we live, the local culture in which we are planted, is intentional, that God placed us here on purpose, and that it is incumbent upon us to protect and to nurture and to cultivate these places that we live. Not only because we look to them to understand who it is that we are, but also because it is the way that God memorializes in space and time what God has done for us. Then the next week we looked at home as a people, and we said that like living stones, we allow ourselves to be built into a new spiritual house in which God Himself dwells. And then this week we talk about home as a path. Now, 2 months ago when I was designing this sermon series, the word was journey. Home is a journey. But journey does not begin with the letter P, and so I had to change it to path so that it would all fit together. Place, people, path, and promise. I'm clever like that. And the scripture that I chose for this week is the parable of the prodigal son, more P's, if you all are paying attention. But that wasn't the reason. The reason is because this is a wonderful story, a wonderful parable that we turn to again and again and again. It's one of those few gems that we have in the Bible that you can look at from so many different angles, and you can engage it in so many different ways and pull so many different things out of it. In fact, I've already preached on it once this year. But when I was looking at it again, something completely different occurred to me. It was different characters that reached out and grabbed me in this text. Now, you all know the story. We've heard it many, many times. We've heard it read. We've read it ourselves. There's a man that has 2 sons, and the younger one says, "Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me my share of the inheritance." And for whatever reason, the father obliges, and the young son goes out and wastes it all. And then he finds himself in need. He finds himself in the middle of a severe famine, and he finds himself desperate and alone, starving. And he has this aha moment, this moment of clarity, and he makes the decision to come back home. And when he does, repentant, expecting maybe that he won't even be allowed back into the family, the father surprises him and brings him into the family, restores him to full membership in this family, and throws a huge party. Of course, the eldest son doesn't like that very much and pouts outside, in which case the father goes out and pleads with him and says, "Son, you have to come in. You have to understand that this brother of yours was dead and is alive again, and that is a call for celebration." Now, it's a wonderful story, and when we look how it was originally set in this series of passages, it's set in the context of Jesus responding to the grumblings of the Pharisees and the scribes. So the Pharisees and the scribes are all upset at Jesus because he's eating, which is an ancient way of accepting sinners and outcasts, prostitutes and tax collectors, and all those undesirable people no one wants to be seen with. And Jesus tells 3 parables, the last of which is this one, to cast the scribes and the Pharisees in the role of the eldest son To say, listen, won't you understand that these people who have been lost out in the world have finally come home, that they have been dead and they are now alive, and they are your brothers, and that they are worthy of being accepted back into this family, into this fellowship, and won't you celebrate? Of course, I have to admit that when I was old enough to read the Bible for myself, the eldest son is not the one that I've always identified with. In fact, I happen to be an eldest son. I'm the oldest of my siblings, and yet from a very young age, I've always identified with that prodigal. And I don't know why. I mean, when I was very young, I wasn't particularly rebellious yet. But I identified with this son. There was just something about his story that was intriguing. And I think what it is has to do with this adventure that he must have had. I mean, the text doesn't say a lot about what happens. It just says that he goes off into some dissolute living. And I'm like, what does that dissolute living look like? I mean, that's just fascinating. And I'm drawn to this story of adventure that this younger son has had, even though I have to guess what that adventure is. And I know I'm not alone because, history and art and music, literature and film are filled with these stories of the journey motif, the restless young man or woman who leaves home and goes out into a far, far away place looking for something. And he or she either finds it or they don't, or they find something else, and then they make that long journey home. I mean, if you look into ancient Greek literature, you have the story of Odysseus in Homer's The Odyssey. That's the kind of story that it is. We have these other epic stories. The Wizard of Oz is a story like that. You have Dorothy who finds herself in a foreign place, trying to get back home, only to find that she's had the power to come home the entire time. And one of my favorite pieces of literature is a novella written by Ernest Hemingway called The Old Man and the Sea. I don't know how many of you all have read that story. It was the one that won him the Pulitzer Prize and the one that he wrote shortly before he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And The Old Man and the Sea is this story about a fisherman in Cuba named Santiago. This old fisherman who everyone calls unlucky, the worst kind of unlucky because he hasn't caught a fish in 84 days. And they tell the children to stay away from this old man so that his bad luck doesn't rub off on you and on the family. But despite all of this, he goes out every day in his disciplined routine, and he goes out to fish, and he comes home without any fish. And the next day he gets up at dawn and he goes back out to fish. And on the 85th day, he goes out far into the Gulf Stream. He has a plan. And he finally hooks a marlin. And it's not just any marlin, it's the most beautiful, magnificent fish you've ever seen. It's this huge, huge, strong fish, so strong that it pulls him far, far out into the Gulf Stream. And for 2 days and 2 nights, Santiago, the old fisherman, wrestles this fish. And every time the fish comes to make a turn, he pulls it in slowly and pulls it in slowly. And he injures himself and he nears exhaustion and nears delirium by the time he finally pulls the fish in and he's able to harpoon it and kill it. And then he lashes it to the side of the boat, and then he has to make the second half of his journey, which is the journey home. And on the way back, sharks, one after another, attack the fish, taking off huge chunks because they're attracted by the scent of the fish in the water, which just makes it that much worse. And so more and more sharks come until finally, by the time Santiago gets back to the shore, having been starving with no fish for 84 days after having caught the most magnificent fish he's ever seen in his life, it is reduced to an 18-foot skeleton. And he goes home and goes to sleep. Now, I love that story. I love that story even though it's heroic and it's tragic at the same time. And I love it for the same reason that I think we love the story of the prodigal son. And the reason is because it's true. It's a true story. Now, I don't mean that it's true and that it records historical events that literally took place, but it is true because it speaks of a human condition. It speaks of that sense of wanderlust, that sense of wanting to go out and to find oneself, that sense of adventure, that calling, that yearning that we all have to go far out where anyone can help us. And even though what he was seeking is not what he came back with, What Santiago did find was this understanding of himself and this blessed experience to wrestle with the most magnificent beast he's ever encountered in his life. And even though he was unable to return with it, what he did return, this understanding of who he was, his character tested against this experience, was far more valuable than the fish. I love this story of the parable of the prodigal son for the same way. I feel called sometimes to go out and understand myself differently than as I was raised in my tradition. I feel this yearning and this longing to go sometimes far out where no one can get me, so that I can test to see the things that I were brought up with, if they're really true. You know, the poet Wendell Berry, who's a local to this area, he lives in Henry County. He wrote an essay years ago about the natural course of events in growing up. And he says that an adolescent will rebel against one's parents because one cannot remain a child and grow up at the same time. But after having rebelled against one's parents and gone out into the world and achieved some type of economic and emotional independence, the adolescent is able to understand one's parents in a different way, as fellow sufferers and travelers in this thing called life, and is able to return and to reconcile and to forgive and to be forgiven for the inevitable troubles of family life. And I think that we have that yearning to go out and to define ourselves, to find ourselves, to find out who we really are. And there's all kinds of danger in doing that, which is why these stories are so attractive to us. It's why you see all that danger in the parable of the prodigal. There's always that tension that the prodigal will succumb to how the world defines him, to how this newfound wealth will define him, to how all these experiences will define him. But fortunately, the parable of the prodigal son shows this moment of clarity that he has, not when he finds what he's looking for. It isn't that he finds himself. It says in verse 17 that he came to himself. That he came to himself. The Greek phrase literally is into self yet coming. In the NRSV translate as coming to himself. We all think we know what that means, that he came to his senses, but it's a very particular phrase, to come to oneself. In fact, when I was studying this text, that's the phrase that reached out and grabbed me. To come to oneself. And I had to ask myself that question. Have I come to myself? Have I had a moment where I came to myself, that I came to my senses, that I had that moment of clarity? And I was so captivated by that idea, I asked people all week long. I said, have you had that experience? I said, you know, this story is about a young man who comes to himself. Have you had an experience where you've come to yourself? And expecting maybe a handful of people to respond, yes, I was overwhelmed by how many people have had these experiences. I was at the coffee shop the other day working on the sermon, and a guy that I know came in to get a coffee. And he saw me and I saw him, and he came over and I said, hey, how you doing? I'm doing well. What are you doing? I'm making some sales calls. And I said, let me ask you a question. I said, you know, I'm studying the parable of the prodigal. And he said, uh-huh. And I said, and there's this captivating phrase in verse 17 that the prodigal came to himself. And that's when he had that moment where he turned around and he no longer was listening to the voice that pulled him out, but he was listening to the voice that would take him home. Have you ever had one of those moments? And he said, have I? And he pulled out a chair and sat down. And what I thought was going to be like a 5-minute conversation ended up being a 2-hour conversation. And he just kept going on and told me this amazing story of a guy who had everything that a person could want. A beautiful family and a wonderful job and all kinds of money. And he said he lost everything. And he found himself with less than nothing in a prison cell. And he said, in that prison cell, in that prison bunk, under the sheets, I was holding a Bible that someone gave me, a Bible I've never read. He said, I'd never read any Bible in my life. And sitting there under the sheets, I wept openly. And I cried out to God, God, why have you left me? Why have you left me to suffer all of these things? And he said, Joe, just as clear as you and I are talking, I could hear God respond. And he said, my son, I've never left you. It's you that left me. But the moment you want to come home, I'm right here. And he said, that was my moment. That was my moment of coming to myself. And that was what it took for me to write the second half of my story. And the guy that was sitting across from me did not look like an ex-convict at all. He has turned his life around because he came to himself and he cried out for God, and he realized that God was going to accept him back home just as he accepted the prodigal. And I think that's the other reason that stories like this are so captivating, because there are people out there like us who have had these experiences, that have had these moments of redemption. Now, what a shame it would be if there are people in this room that have those kinds of stories and are content to just file it away in the ancient past. I mean, what a tragedy it would be if there are people in this sanctuary who have had these kinds of experiences, who have gone far, far out and maybe even done shameful things. And they've had that moment of clarity, and they've had that moment of redemption. They've heard the Word of God calling them back home, and they've followed that call all the way home, and then they're just content not to say anything about it. And I have to say that part of a homecoming is the journey. It is the path. Our homecoming is our stories. And there might be someone in this room, and you might be the only one that can reach a certain person who comes into this sanctuary thinking that they're the only one that's had that kind of experience. There might be someone that comes in here with all kinds of pain and heartache of dealing with depression or of divorce or the death of a loved one. And they might think that they're the only one that has struggled with this kind of situation. And there are people in this room that might be the only ones that can reach out and say, no, I've had that experience. I know what that is like. I have felt that kind of pain. And let me tell you about the God that will redeem you and call you home. And so we have to be shameless about our stories. We have to own up our stories as things that God has done in our life, so that we can put these things that have happened in our lives into the hands of God, and God can turn them into something magnificent. That story of redemption is so powerful. It has so much power to it. And we have to share that. We have to make sure that when people come into this room, that they are coming home, and there is nothing that is going to keep them from the gates of heaven except their own unwillingness to walk through the doors. And when they come home, we have to be the ones here that welcome them. For the lost and the hurting, the lonely, the brokenhearted, we have to be the ones that say, I've been where you've been, and I've struggled, I've been there on my knees, I've heard the voice of God calling me home, and I've come home, and for that reason, you are called home too to this place. It's how we are called to be a people. We're called to be a church home for those who need a church home, who need the things that only a home can provide, the love and the comfort, the celebration of God and all the angels. And so the question is put to us whether we will do that, whether we will use our experiences, whether we will use those moments that we've had in our lives as the prodigal, and those moments that we've had in our lives of redemption and homecoming, to open the doors and welcome others. And I, for one, I hope that we do. Amen.